I've worked in Grandpa's shop for most of my life. It's been the first job for not just me, but all of my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff, and he does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent, and he can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit on it after a while, but I enjoyed the work, and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. You keep at it, kid, and someday this old shop will be yours. Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back, and it's been a pretty good arrangement. Every evening he turns on the radio and cracks a beer, and we sit around and drink, and he tells stories from back in the day. The radio never seemed to make any noise, and I asked him why he kept it around. He told me it was something he had done for a long time, and it was special. I asked how old the radio was and how it was special, and he said that it was a long story and if I had time for it. I said I didn't have anything else to do but just sit here and listen to the rain, and Grandpa settled in as his old thing clickled and plunked in the background. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. Technically, he grew up in the 40s and 50s, but in a lot of his stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it is because of his father, my great grandpa. He grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother had died when he was 14, and his father opened up a pawn shop with the money he'd gotten from her life insurance policy. They weren't called pawn shops at this point. I think Grandpa said what my great grandfather had was a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and tried to sell him strange and wondrous things sometimes. Great grandpa had run the place with his family, which consisted of my grandfather, my great grandmother, my great grandfather, and my great uncle Terry. Great grandmother lived with them, but she didn't help around the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room as she knitted and waited to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was a little tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop since he needed money to pay for his own apartment, and he said that they got some of the strangest little things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't strictly normal. Dad would usually buy things that he knew he could sell easily: appliances, tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, would often buy things that were a little less easy to move. He bought a bunch of old movie props, once from a guy who claimed that they were genuine props from an old Bluesium film, and Dad lost his shirt from them. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought that jewelry that turned out to be stolen. But that was okay, because they turned it into the police, and the reward was worth way more than what they had even spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices and then the best choices. And sometimes they were all the same choices, all at once. So, of course, Terry had been the one to buy the radio. Dad had been sick for about a week, and it had been bad for enough that the family had worried he might not come back from it. People in those times didn't always get over sicknesses. and unless you had money to go see a doctor, you either got better or you didn't. He had finally hacked it all up and got better, and was ready to return to work. So he comes downstairs to the floor where Terry is sitting there reading some kind of artsy fantasy magazine, and he looks over and sees that they've taken in a new radio. This big old German model with dark wooded cabinets and dials that looked out of a Frankenstein lab. He thinks that looks pretty good, and he congratulates Terry, telling him everybody wants a good radio, and that will be really easy to sell. Terry looks up from his magazine and tells him it isn't a radio. Dad asks him just what the hell is it then? And Terry lays down his magazine and gives him the biggest, creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio, Terry announces, like that's supposed to mean something. I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had the conversation, and Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in. After buying a bunch of counterfeit movie posters, the kind that Dad didn't need an expert to tell him they were fake, Uncle Terry had put on a strict $100 a month budget of things he could buy for the shop. Anything over $100, he had to go and talk to my dad about it. And since Dad hadn't had any visits from Uncle Terry, other than to bring him food in the last week, Dad knew that it either had cost less than $100 or Uncle Terry hadn't asked. How much did it cost, Terry? Dad asked, clearly expecting to be angry. Terry seemed to edge off a little. It's nothing, Brian. The thing will pay for itself by the end of the month. You'll see. I'll show you what this thing really is. How much? My dad asked, making it sound like a threat. 500. But, Brian, I've already made back 200 of that. Give me another week and I'll... But Dad had heard enough. You spent $500 on this thing. It better be gold-plated, because $500 is a lot of money for a damn radio. Terry tried to explain, but Dad wasn't having any of it. He told Terry to get out of the shop for a while. Otherwise, he was probably going to commit homicide, to be honest. And Terry suddenly remembered a friend he had to see and made himself scarce. Then Dad rounds on me like I had something to do with it, and asked how much Terry had really spent on the thing. I told him he had actually spent about $550 on it, and Dad asked why in heaven's name no one had consulted him before spending such an astronomical sum. The truth of the matter was, I was a little spooked by the radio. The guy had brought it in on a rainy afternoon, a dolly covered by an old blanket, and when he wheeled up to the counter, I had come to see what he had brought. Terry was already there, reading and doing a lot of nothing, and he had that perked up when the old guy told him he had something miraculous to show him. I didn't care for the old guy myself. He sounded Georgian, East or West German, and his glass eye wasn't fooling anyone. He whipped the quilt off the cabinet like a showman doing a trick, and there was the spirit radio. I mean, Lacidity. Uncle Terry asked him what it was, and the man said he would be happy to demonstrate. He took out a pocket knife and cut his finger, sprinkling the blood into a bowl of crystals on top of it. As the blood fell onto the rocks, the dials began to glow and the thing hummed to life. Uncle Terry had started to tell the man that he didn't have to do that, but as it glowed and crooned, his protest died on his lips. Spirit radio, the man said. Who will win tomorrow's baseball game? The Phillies. the box intoned in a deep and unsettling voice. We'll defeat the Cubs 9-7. Uncle Terry looked ready to buy it on the spot, but when he asked what the man wanted for it, he balked a little at the price. They dickered, going back and forth for nearly half an hour until they finally settled on $550. I could see Dad getting mad again, so I told him the rest of it too. Harry isn't wrong either. He's been using that spirit radio thing on a bet on different stuff. The Phillies actually did win their game the next day, 9-7, and he's been making bets and collecting debts over ever since he ever got it. He's paid the store back $200, but I know he's gonna win. He had to have won more than that. Dad still looked mad, but he looked intrigued too. Dad didn't put a lot of stock in weirdness, but he understood money. I saw him look at the spirit radio, look at the bowl of crystals on top of it, and when he dug out his old buck knife, I turned away before I could watch him slice himself. He grunted and squeezed a few drops over the bowl, and when the radio appeared to life, I turned back to see it glowing. It had an eerie blue glow, the dial softly emitting light through the foggy glass, and it always made me shiver when I watched it. To this day, I think those were spirits, ghosts, or those who had used it, but who knows? Dad hesitated, maybe sensing what I sensed too, and when he spoke, his voice quivered for the first time I could ever remember. "I will win the first race at the dog track tomorrow," he asked. The radio softly hummed and contemplated and finally whispered, "Mama's boy will win the first race of the day at Olsen Park track tomorrow." Dad rubbed his face, and I could hear the scrub of his stubble on his palm. He thought about it, resting a hand on the box, and went to the register to see what we had made while he was gone. When Uncle Terry came back, Dad handed him an envelope and told him to shut up when he tried to explain himself. "You'll be at Olsen Park track tomorrow for the first race. You will take the money in the envelope. You will bet every cent of it on Mama's boy to win in the first race, and you will bring me all the winnings back. If you lose that money, I will put this thing in the window. I will sell it as a regular radio, and you will never be allowed to purchase anything from the shop again." "And if he wins?" Terry had asked, but Dad didn't answer. Grandpa took a sip of his beer, then, and got a faraway look as he contemplated. That was just how Grandpa told stories. He always looked like he was living in the times when he was talking about it. And I suppose in a lot of ways he was. He was going back to the 1960s, the most interesting time of his young life. The time when he encountered something he couldn't quite explain. "So did he win?" I asked, invested now as we sat in the apartment above the shop, drinking beer and watching the rain. "Yeah." "Oh, yes," Grandpa said. "He won, and when Uncle Terry came back with the money, I think my dad was as surprised as Terry was. Terry had been using it, but I always felt like he was operating under the idea that it was some kind of monkey's paw situation, and after a while, there would be a accounting for what he had won. When a month went by, however, and there was no downside to using the radio, Terry got a little more comfortable. He started to ask it other things, the results of boxing matches, horse races, sporting events, and anything else he could think of. He got so bad that his fingers started to look like pincushions, and he started cutting into his palms and arms. It seemed like more blood equaled better results. Sometimes he could get play-by-play if he bled more for it. Dad would use it sparingly, still not liking to give it its blood. Uncle Terry was adamant about it. It was a mania in him, and even though it hurt him, he used it a lot. He could always be seen hanging around the radio, talking to it and feeding it. Dad didn't like the method, but he liked the money it brought in. The shop was doing better than ever, thanks to the cash injection from the spirit radio, and Dad was buying better things to stock it with. He bought some cars, some luxury electronics, and always had a net gain to the store once they sold. Times were good. Everyone was doing well, but that's when Uncle Terry took it too far. He brought the bottle to his mouth, but it didn't quite make it. He seemed to get stuck halfway there, the contents spilling on his undershirt as he watched the rain. He jumped when the cold liquid touched him and righted it, putting it down before launching, laughing at himself. He shook the drops off his shirt and looked back at the rain, running his tongue over his dry lips. One night we tied on a few too many, and my uncle got this really serious look on his face. He staggered downstairs, despite Dad yelling at him, asking him where he was going. When he started yelling, we ran downstairs to see what happened. He was leaning over the spirit radio, the tip of his finger dripping as he yelled at it. He held out, letting the blood fall onto the crystal dish on top of the radio, and as it came to life, he put his ruddy face very close to the wooden cabinet and blistered out his question. Clearly not for the first time. When will I die? The radio was silent, the lights blinking, but it didn't return an answer. He cut another finger, asking the same question, but still never answered. Before we could stop him, he had split his palm almost to the wrist, and as the blood dripped onto the stones, he nearly screamed his question. When will I die? The spirit radio still said nothing, and Dad and I had to restrain him before he could do it again. We don't know what brought this on. We never found out, but Uncle Terry became very interested in death, and more specifically when he was going to die. I don't know. Maybe all the spirit talk got him thinking. Maybe he was afraid that one day his voice was going to come out of the radio. Whatever the case, Dad put a stop to using it. He hid the thing, and he had to keep moving it because Uncle Terry always found it again. He would hide it for a day or two, but eventually we would find him bleeding from his palms and pressing his face against it. Sometimes I could hear him whispering to it like it was talking back to him. I didn't like those times. It was creepy, but Uncle Terry was attached at the hip to this damn radio. It went on for about a month until Uncle Terry did something unforgivable and got his answer. He watched the rain for a moment longer, his teeth chattering a little as if he were trying to get sound out of his head. Grandpa didn't care much for the rain. I had known him to close the shop if it got really bad, and it always seemed to make him extremely uncomfortable. That's why we were sitting up here in the first place, and I believe that Grandpa would have liked to be drinking something a little stronger. Dad and I got a call about something big, something he really wanted. It was an old armoire, an antique from the Civil War era, and the guy selling it, and at least according to Dad, was asking way less than what it was worth. He wanted me to come along to help him move it, and said he didn't feel like Terry would be any use in this. He's been flaky lately, obsessed with that damn radio. Won't even leave the house. To say that Terry had been flaky was an understatement. Uncle Terry had been downright weird. He never left the shop, just kept looking for the radio, and I started to notice a weird smell sometimes around the house. I suspected that he wasn't bathing, and I never saw him eat or sleep. He just hunted for the radio and fed it its blood when he found it. Dad had already asked him, and Terry said he was busy. So, Dad had told him to keep an eye on Mother. Mother, my great-grandmother, had been suffering from dementia for years, and Dad and Uncle Terry had decided to keep an eye on her instead of just putting her in a home. Terry had agreed, and as we left the house, the rain had started to come down. That's what I'll always remember about that day. The rain came down in buckets like the sky was crying for what was about to happen. We got the lawnmower onto the trailer. The guy had the thick old quilts that we put over it to stop it from getting wet, and when we got back to the shop, we brought it in and left it in the back room. Dad was smiling. He knew he had something special here and was excited to see what he could get for it. We both squished as we went upstairs to get some fresh clothes on, joking about the trip until we got to the landing. Dad put out a hand, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed. I could smell it too, though I couldn't I couldn't identify it at the time. Dad must have recognized it because he burst into the apartment like a cop looking for dope. Uncle Terry was sitting in the living room, his hands red and his knees getting redder by the minute. He was rocking back and forth, the spirit radio glowing beside him. As he repeated the same thing again and again, he had found it, wherever Dad had hidden it, and had clearly been up to his old tricks again. Dad stood over him as he rocked, his fists tightening like he wanted to hit him. And when he growled at him, I took a step away, sensing the rage that was building in there. "What have you done?" he asked. "Today." "It's today?" Harry kept repeating it, rocking back and forth as he sobbed to himself. Dad turned to the bowl on top of the spirit radio and must have not liked what he saw. I saw it later, after everything that came next, and it was full of blood. The crystals were swimming in it, practically floating in the thick red blood. Dad seemed to be doing the math. There was more blood than a fingerprint or a palm cut, and Dad was clearly getting worried, given that Uncle Terry was still conscious. "Where's Mom?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Today. It's today." "Where's our mother, Terry?" Dad yelled, leaning down to grab him by the collar and pull him up. Uncle Terry had blood on his hands up to the elbows, but instead of dripping off onto the floor, it stayed caked on him in thick, dry patches. The shaking seemed to have brought him out of his haze. It said if I wanted the answer, I had to sacrifice, Terry said, his voice cracking. It said I had to give up something important if I wanted to know something so important, something I loved. The others weren't enough. I didn't even know them, but mother was. But he stopped stammering when Dad wrapped his hands around his throat. He choked him, shaking him violently as he screamed wordlessly into his face, and when he dropped him, Uncle Terry didn't move. Dad and I just stood there for a second, Dad seeming to remember that I was there at all. When he caught sight of the softly glowing radio, the subject of my uncle's obsession, he pivoted and lifted his foot to kick the thing. I could tell he meant to destroy it, not stop kicking until it was splinters on the floor, but something stopped him. Whether it was regret for what he had done or something otherworldly But worse, my dad found himself unable to strike the cabinet. Maybe he was afraid of letting the spirits out. I would never know. Instead, he went to call the police so they can come and collect the bodies. They may also collect him. But we didn't talk about that. We just sat in silence until they arrived. Dad told the police that my uncle had admitted to killing his mother, and he had killed him in a blind rage. They went to the back bedroom and confirmed that my mother was dead. Dad didn't tell me until he lay dying of cancer years later, but Jerry had cut her heart out and offered it to the bull on top of the radio. We assumed he did, at least, because we never found any evidence of it in the house or the bull. It was never discovered, and the police believed he had grounded it up. They also discovered bodies of 3 homeless men rotting in the back of Terry's closet. He had bled them. Something that had stained the wood in that room so badly that we had to replace it. How he had done all this without anyone noticing, we have no fucking idea. He had to have been luring them in while we were out doing other things, and if it hadn't been for my grandmother's death being directly linked to him, I truly believe Dad would have been as much of a suspect as Uncle Terry. They took the bodies away. They took the bowl away. So they returned it later and ended up moving in with Dad. He got kind of depressed after the whole thing, and it helped to have someone there with him. I've lived here ever since, eventually taking over the business, and you pretty much know the rest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the rain come down and the static from the old radio as it crackled. Have you ever used the radio? I asked, a little afraid of the answer. Grandpa shook his head. I saw what it did to Uncle Terry, and to a lesser degree what it did to my dad. I've run this shop since his death, and I did it without the radio. Then why keep it? I asked, looking at the old thing a little differently now. Because like Dad, I can't bring myself to destroy it, and I won't sell it to someone else, so it could ruin their life too. When the shop is yours, it'll be your burden, and the choice of whatever you do with it will be up to you. I couldn't help but watch the radio, seeing it differently than I had earlier. As we sat drinking, I thought I could hear something under the sound of the rain. It sounded like a low, melancholy moan that came from sliding from the speakers, like a whispered scream. Was my great uncle's voice in there somehow? I suppose one day I might find out.